All right, everyone, we'll get started. Thank you all very much for being here. I am Clark Ervin, the director of the Homeland Security program here at the Aspen Institute. Delighted to see such a wonderful gathering today. We have a terrific speaker, Peter Bergen, and looking forward very much to a discussion about this important new book he's written, The Longest War, The Enduring Conflict Between America and Al-Qaeda. Let me say at the beginning, please silence your cell phones and other communication devices. And just two or three quick words of an administrative nature to start, and then we'll get into the conversation. I want to thank Ambassador Joseph and Mrs. Alma Gildenhorn for their generous support. This book series is made possible by the generosity of the Gildenhorn, so thank you very much for that. Also, two mentions of upcoming events, one in the very near term and one later this year, this summer. Next week, March 1 will mark the 8th anniversary of the Department of Homeland Security. Appropriately, this year, most attention will focus on the 10th anniversary in September of 9/11. Few people will note, in all likelihood, that, as I say, Tuesday, March 1 marks the 8th anniversary of the founding of the department created in response to the attack. So to mark that occasion, there will be a discussion among Secretary Napolitano and both her two predecessors, founding Secretary Tom Ridge and the second Secretary Michael Chertoff, moderated by NBC News' Andrea Mitchell, and we'll hold that in partnership with Georgetown University School of Foreign Service on the campus of Georgetown Tuesday morning from 9 to 10:30 in Gaston Hall. So please join us for that. Details are on the Aspen website. And secondly, I want to mention to all of you that this summer, July 27 to 30, I hope to see all of you in Aspen for the second annual Aspen Security Forum, where we bring together top-level President and former government officials, industry leaders, and others to talk about in great detail the major issues of the day in the field of Homeland Security and counterterrorism. Peter was part of the group last summer and has agreed to be with us again this summer, and we're looking forward very much to that. So with that, by way of beginning, let's plunge right in. Peter needs no introduction, but let me give a short one. As we all know, Peter Bergen is one of the nation's, and I would argue the world's, leading experts on terrorism. He is a national security analyst at CNN. He's a frequent commentator on terrorism issues in the New York Times, the Washington Post, other eminent publications. He is a fellow at the New America Foundation here in Washington and also has an affiliation at New York University's Center on Law and Security. He's been a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's a graduate of New College at Oxford and the author of many important books on terrorism. And the latest is what we're here to discuss today. As I say, The Longest War, the Enduring Conflict Between America and Al-Qaeda. And Peter is kind enough to stay afterwards, and there'll be an opportunity to purchase the book, and Peter will sign it. So Peter, let me begin. There are a number in the book, I think, of interesting and arresting arguments that you make in. And one of them is that, contrary, I think, to what most people would say, 9/11 was actually, in your view, a major strategic miscalculation on Al-Qaeda's part. Now, 3,000 people were killed, targets of American power were hit. There was untold economic damage to the country, and this was done by 19 individuals as opposed to nation states with nuclear weapons, which had been the preoccupation of policymakers for generations. So why, in your view, was 9/11 a strategic miscalculation on Al-Qaeda's part?
Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you, Clark, for the invitation. Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic, and they lost their base in Afghanistan as a result of 9/11. And this was something that was predicted by certain people in Al-Qaeda before the event happened. So, for instance, I interviewed for the book a guy called Noman Ben-Othman, who was one of the leaders of the Islamic Fighting Group, and he, which was a group loosely affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and he went to Kandahar in the summer of 2000 to attend a kind of summit meeting of jihadi leaders. And he essentially said to bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, that they essentially hadn't read Mao and that they were making a set of predictable mistakes that jihadis had already encountered in Algeria in the 90s, which was not basically recruiting the population. Point one, and point two, attacking the United States would be counterproductive, because if the goal was regime change in the Middle East, attacking the United States was likely, A, not to change it, and B, likely to produce big problems for Al-Qaeda and its allied groups in Afghanistan. we know from the 9/11 Commission report that a number of senior members of Al-Qaeda also were opposed the 9/11 attacks, either because on religious grounds, Abu Hafs, the Mauritanian, who was one of their religious counselors, said it was against Islam to do such an attack, or on grounds of efficacy. Now, one of the points I try and make in the book is that Al-Qaeda is not a democracy. Am I having problems with the audio on this? Because it
No,
sounds sort
actually,
of weird.
I
Okay.
think you're being heard
So I'm-
perfectly well.
Okay. The Al-Qaeda is not a democracy. It is run as a dictatorship by Osama bin Laden, which causes problems because when bin Laden's ideas are wrong, there's no one who can confront him to say that his ideas are wrong. We know this from the substitution of testimony in the Zakaris Moussawi case by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed describes the Shura Council of Al-Qaeda as being, if 98% of the Shura have one view and bin Laden has another, he can overrule them. So bin Laden also began to believe his own propaganda, which of course is the worst thing you can do. And in interviews that he did with CNN, the one that I produced in '97, and in other interviews that he did, he routinely compared the United States to the Soviet Union and based that analysis on the American pullout from Vietnam, Somalia, and Beirut. Well, the United States is not going to pull out of New York just because we were attacked there. It was a wrong analogy, and but he was one that he very firmly believed. And so he did the attack, which was an enormous tactical success, but it was a strategic failure because it didn't achieve any of the key goals that he intended, which were an American pullout of the Middle East, the crumbling of the Mubarak regime and of the Saudi royal family as a result of the American pullout. We didn't pull out. We invaded, occupied Afghanistan, Iraq. Our relations with Mubarak and the Saudi royal family became closer based on our shared goal of defeating Islamist militants. So that's why I make the argument it was a strategic failure. By the way, if and post facto, Al-Qaeda, recognizing that their central war aims weren't achieved, then started explaining that they actually had different war aims, that this was all part of a clever plot to drag us into Afghanistan. They started making that argument 4 years after the fact. And in fact, there's no evidence that they prepared for an American invasion of Afghanistan at all. What they anticipated were cruise missile attacks as they anticipated in 1998 after the embassy attacks, or at most American airstrikes. And in fact, Mullah Omar didn't think the Americans were going to attack at all, according to interviews and also Mullah Zaif's biography that we now have one of the senior leaders of the Taliban. So, and one final point, Clark, because you mentioned the economic damage. These guys aren't economists. The 9/11 attacks cost $500 billion to American. But at the time, the American economy was a little over $10 trillion. So this was about 4 to 5% of GDP. Significant, but it was not it didn't bankrupt the United States. And right now, we're spending historically very low levels of GDP on our defense budgets. If the idea is to bankrupt us by bringing us into Afghanistan, we're only spending 1% of GDP in Afghanistan.
Well, of course, 9/11 was a massive intelligence failure on the part of the United States, but in terms of the response by the United States to 9/11, in what sense were there strategic miscalculations by the United States?
Well, I think the overthrow of the Taliban was one of the great victories of unconventional warfare in modern history, conducted with 110 CIA officers and 300 Special Forces officers on the ground. That was a big success, but the same set of ideas about success in overthrowing the Taliban turned out to be the same set of ideas that allowed bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to escape at the Battle of Tora Bora. And in the book, I have a pretty forensic reconstruction of the Battle of Tora Bora told from Al-Qaeda's point of view, the Afghan warlords' point of view, the CIA point of view, and the Special Forces point of view. I was able to get that because quite a number of Al-Qaeda guys who were at the Battle of Tora Bora were in Guantanamo and told what happened there, or have been released and given interviews. And we have bin Laden's own account of the Battle of Tora Bora. But the point is that there were more American journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than there were American soldiers. I can say that with some precision because there were 70 American, if you take together the Special Boat Service, there were a dozen of them, and then you add the American SF and CIA and small numbers of Air Force controllers on the ground. we're looking at about 70 people, and there were probably about 100 journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora as it went on. So the point is that because of a lot of institutional things in the U.S. military, aversion to, don't forget, no American soldiers, only one American soldier had been killed in Afghanistan by the time the Battle of Tora Bora happened, I think. More journalists had been killed. Four journalists were killed, had been killed already. So the last war the United States had been engaged in was Kosovo, where there had been no American casualties. And the U.S. military was very risk averse, was very concerned about search and rescue operations, and just decided that when they got the request, General Tommy Franks, I interviewed via email about this issue, when he got the request from Han Crumpton, the head of the CIA operations in Afghanistan at the time, for more soldiers, he said no. And retrospectively, he says the reason that he said no was concern about American soldiers on the ground being irritant to the locals, concerns about perhaps replicating some of the failures of the Soviets, which was again a mistaken analogy. The Soviets killed 1 million Afghans, made a third of them homeless. We weren't doing that in Afghanistan and haven't done since. And he also retrospectively said we didn't really know if bin Laden was there. This became an issue in the 2004 election because it was one of the very few things that John Kerry was able to have on George W. Bush that was a really particularly a good campaign issue, which was that bin Laden had been let go at the Battle of Tora Bora. Both Vice President Cheney, President Bush, and Tommy Franks all basically publicly said in the run-up to that very tight election that they didn't know if bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora. I'm afraid that is either prevarication or kind of astonishing, given the fact that this was the most important battle of the war on terrorism, because it was well known at the time that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora. And in the book, I use public statements by Cheney himself, Paul Wolfowitz, even Tommy Franks' own autobiography indicates that there was a general understanding he was there. And then, if you look at you can find this online very easily. The United States Special Forces has an official history of the Battle of Tora Bora, and it says in that there was multiple sources of intelligence from December 9th to December 14th that bin Laden was present at the Battle of Tora Bora.
That raises the larger question of responsibility. One of the things that you decry in the book is that, unlike the case in Pearl Harbor, say, that no one resigned, no one was fired as a result of the intelligence failure that led to 9/11 or the response to 9/11 that we just discussed. Can you talk a little bit about that issue?
Sure. I mean, I think maybe in Britain somebody would have resigned at a minimum. In Japan, somebody might have sort of committed harikari. In China, somebody might have been executed. Instead, in the United States, nothing. Everybody got promoted. Probably that's a slight exaggeration. But the point is that no one did take responsibility. The first person who took responsibility publicly was Richard Clarke, who famously said, "Your government failed you, and I failed you," when he spoke at the 9/11 hearings. And the 9/11 Commission, which is a wonderful work of history and was a great piece of investigation and writing, and was intended not to, right from the beginning, the way it was set up was not intended to personally single people out for responsibility. It looked at institutional failures and there were plenty of institutional failures, but there were individual failures as well. And so in the book, I try and point out who was individually responsible, or not responsible is too strong a word, but asleep at the switch, I think, is fair enough. If you look at I did a very simple thing, which is look at the public statements of all the senior Bush administration officials before 9/11, which you can do with a Nexus search very easily. You will find that there's nothing about Al-Qaeda or bin Laden by President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, etc. And we also know now from the 9/11 Commission that they were privately saying nothing about it, and publicly they were publicly saying nothing about it, and privately they were doing nothing about it also. I mean, they had one meeting out of 33 cabinet meetings about Al-Qaeda a week before 9/11. They had a meeting almost immediately coming into office about the supposedly pressing issue of Iraq, and they were preoccupied by China, Iraq, and anti-ballistic missile defense, which of course does nothing to prevent terrorist attacks. And so they just didn't get it.
All that said,
Yeah.
It's impossible, I'd argue, to divide your politics from the book because you're equally harsh on the Clinton administration. Can you talk a little bit about what
Actually,
you regard
I'm not equally harsh on the Clinton administration on these sets of facts, because I think that the Clinton administration actually did a better job. The Clinton administration, came into office as do the thought experiment, by the way, if Al Gore had won the election against George W. Bush, I think the Democratic Party would have gone out of business, more or less, because the entire rise of Al-Qaeda would have been on the Democratic Party watch. Because the Al-Qaeda really only comes to the attention of the American intelligence community in 1993. There was a CIA analyst called Gina Bennett who wrote a very prescient assessment of Al-Qaeda, mentioning the word Al-Qaeda by name in a State Department. She worked at INR, which of course has always done some of the best work on this. And she and others were beginning to paying attention to Al-Qaeda in 93. I think the Clinton administration did begin to understand that this was a big problem. They did respond with the ineffectual cruise missile attacks. They didn't respond to the coal, partly I think because of exhaustion, and it was at the end of their second term. It's not really clear why they didn't, and of course the Bush administration never responded to the coal either. But I think Sandy Berger's response to the Millennium threats, I think, are instructive as a comparison to Condoleezza Rice's responses to the threats in the summer of 2001. Sandy Berger was having almost daily meetings, according to multiple people who were in those meetings that I interviewed, about the Millennium threat, the idea that there might be an attack on the Millennium. And he really was a battle station. Condoleezza Rice publicly testified to the 9/11 Commission that the Bush administration was at battle stations in the summer of 2001. There's simply no evidence for that. They weren't at battle stations. In fact, President Bush took the longest presidential vacation in 3 decades in the summer of 2001. I think that speaks for itself.
Now, it's a very good segue, because I want to talk now about the summer of 2001 and the run-up to 9/11. One of the things that we all know now, in retrospect, thanks largely to the work of the 9/11 Commission, is that there was lots of classified intelligence pointing to the possibility of 9/11. What I think your book brings out to a greater degree, I think, than any other to date, is that there was also lots of open source information, publicly available, TV broadcasts, news articles, etc., pointing to 9/11. In the summer of 2001, I just want to mention one that you mentioned in passing in the book. I'm just going to quote a couple of short paragraphs. This is a July 8, 2001 Washington Post story about an interview of bin Laden by a TV reporter for a Saudi-owned television station based in London called the Middle East Broadcasting Center, and the reporter who did the interviews named Atiani. Bin Laden uttered only occasional pleasantries, telling aides to do most of the talking during the 3-hour meeting in his desert hideaway. His reticence was apparently in keeping with his pledge to the Afghan authorities who harbor him that he will not use his Afghan base as a launching pad for political statements or foreign adventures. But his aides delivered a message that was direct, clear, and chilling. They said that there would be attacks against American and Israeli facilities within the next several weeks. I am 100% sure of this, Aitani said. It was absolutely clear that they had brought me there to hear this message. This is but one of many such warnings, you say, during the summer of 2001 that was open for all to see in plain sight.
Right. Well, Clark, I'm glad you dug up that story from the Washington Post, which was written by Pam Constable. The Washington Post was reporting this on July 8th in Washington. That Al-Qaeda was threatening serious attacks on the United States. So it wasn't a secret, and in fact, it was part of I won't give you chapter and verse, because there was so much of this that was out there in the years running up to 9/11. Of course, we'd been attacked by people affiliated with Al-Qaeda already in the United States with the February 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. And Akram Rassam, who was a member of an Algerian group affiliated with Al-Qaeda, had tried to blow up LAX airport in December of 1999. It was well known, and he was arrested. So it was, there was plenty of information that was out there publicly to show that Al-Qaeda intended and actually had already tried to attack the United States, not just American targets overseas. That said, I was as surprised as anybody else on 9/11. I was here in Washington. I remember it very well, as I'm sure everybody in the room does. It was obvious to me that it was bin Laden, but in the summer of 2001, I thought it was much more plausible that it would be an attack on an American embassy in Saudi Arabia, or a target like, it was hard to, even though one knew that they had attacked here already, it was hard to believe that they would succeed.
Right. Well, what's the larger message from this failure to take this open source intelligence information seriously? Is there a fetish, do you think, in the intelligence community for information that's secret, that's stolen?
You know, I mean, Clark and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. John McLaughlin has made a very good distinction between secrets and mysteries, which are, you know, the status of the Iranian nuclear program is a secret that we, you know, I presume the intelligence agencies have a pretty good grasp of. Mysteries are things that are basically unpredictable, like what's going on right now in the Middle East. Everybody knows that these regimes had a lot of problems, and they were going to unsustainable problems that would blow up at some point. The question is when. That's very hard to predict. But I think on the open source question, I think that one of the things I say in the book is that the Vietnam War was the first TV war, and the Gulf War was the first cable news war. Iraq was obviously the first internet war, in the sense that Al-Qaeda and groups like it in the insurgency were posting in real time videos of all their attacks and all their statements, and it was all publicly available information, and it coincided with the rise of broadband internet access, which meant that you could put videotape on the internet and it would, you know, it could be seen widely. And you know, I think the problem is we're drowning in a sea of open source information, all of which is quite useful. Look at the Taliban, which had banned television under, you know, when they ran the country, and now has, you know, spokesmen on call 24 hours and a very active video production arm and websites in different languages. And a lot of what you need to know about the Taliban is out there publicly. Sure, the location of Mullah Omar is a secret, and it's a secret that the intelligence agencies seem to have done a pretty poor job of finding out. But so as a general proposition, I think that I'm a journalist, so I operate in the open source, and I don't have access to classified information. But, you know, Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States for the first time in the course of an interview on CNN that I produced. It wasn't a secret. It was completely well known that he was planning to attack the United States from 1997 forward.
Since you mentioned the present unrest in the Middle East, I was going to get to that eventually, but since you mentioned it now, what are the implications of what's going on now in Bahrain, in Libya, elsewhere in Yemen, elsewhere in the Middle East with regard to Al-Qaeda?
I think, you know, if Osama bin Laden is sitting in his comfortably appointed hideaway in northwest Pakistan, is looking at this with a mixture of glee and despair. Glee because his central aim, the disappearance of the dictators and monarchies of the Middle East, is happening. Despair because it's got nothing to do with him or his ideas or his allies, and the outcome is not going to be to his liking. I mean, you know, bin Laden wanted regime change in the Middle East to install Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco, and Muslims are really not clamoring for that kind of form of government, particularly not the ones that are involved in the revolutions in these countries. They are interested in elections, respect for human rights, a plan to bring the economies of these countries back from stagnation, etc. None of Al-Qaeda doesn't have you know, an economics minister or a social welfare service or any. It's not offering anything. It's offering essentially violence and the promise of the Taliban-style utopia here on earth. And Muslims have already seen what the Taliban-style utopia looked like in Afghanistan. There's nothing quite like living in the Taliban-style utopia to have a kind of suspicion that this may not be the right way forward. Only 7% of Afghans have a favorable view of the Taliban right now because they know that there is nothing, you know, Taliban, Al-Qaeda is not offering anything. So I think that one of the themes I make in the book is that Al-Qaeda is losing the war of ideas in the Muslim world, not because the United States is winning them certainly, because that was always a very naive way to look at it, but because they're losing them. Support for bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, suicide bombing is cratering in the Muslim world, and the events that are going on in the Middle East right now to simply confirm their complete irrelevance to what's going to happen in the future.
Speaking of the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, both then and now, you know, in the book you make it clear that Mullah Omar was kept in the dark by bin Laden about plans for 9/11. The arrangement that the Taliban had with Al-Qaeda was that he could live there, use that as a base, but not launch foreign adventures, as this article said, from there. And now we are beginning to negotiate with at least certain elements of the Taliban. Does that history suggest that there are indeed elements of the Taliban with which we can profitably negotiate, and that the nexus between Afghanistan and the Taliban is not quite as close as conventional wisdom holds?
You know, Steve Cole, my boss, colleague, and friend, has a very important piece in the New Yorker right now saying that the United States has opened direct negotiations with the Taliban, which is really the first time that anybody's reported on this. Quite who the United States is talking to isn't clear from the piece, and I'm sure one of the problems about negotiations is you don't want to identify the people you're negotiating with this early in the game because they'll end up dead. And so, but the Taliban is not a monolithic force. There are many Talibans. I'm actually quite skeptical about what can be achieved with the most important leaders of the Taliban. Mullah Omar awarded himself the title of Commander of the Faithful, which is a rarely invoked religious title used by the rightly minded successors of the caliphs in the Prophet Muhammad's time, which suggests that he's a religious fanatic, and the history of successful negotiations with religious fanatics is not encouraging. But I think that he was prepared to lose everything on a point of principle, and he did. He's not Henry Kissinger. He's not. I don't think there's going to be a Mullah Omar Nixon goes to China moment with Mullah Omar. I think that he's. So that said, there are elements of the Taliban that you can always do bribe, coerce. I mean, there's a very interesting piece by Carlotta Gul in the Times yesterday about these mid-level Taliban commanders essentially saying, we've been really kind of echoing some of the things David Petraeus is saying, but from the Taliban point of view, which is that we've been given the United States has really put a lot of pressure on us, and we've got our senior leadership saying in Pakistan saying, well, you should go back, and we don't really want to do that into Afghanistan. It's very easy for you guys sitting in Peshawar to say, go back and fight. So that there is dissension. Insurgencies do end by people talking to each other. There's always a point about talking to each other, which is gathering information about the enemy, finding out points of contention between the groups. But I think there are a long laundry list of reasons why it's going to take a very long time. The Taliban, their central goal is the removal of international forces. If that happened, right now the Afghan government would fall, not because the Taliban are so strong, because the government's so weak and the army's so weak. And so, and the other thing is the Taliban haven't really explained what they want. We know what they don't want. They don't want international forces in Afghanistan, but what role do they see for women? What role do they see for Al-Qaeda? And it's not just Al-Qaeda, by the way. Every Islamic insurgent and terrorist group in the world was based or headquartered in Afghanistan before 9/11. So it's just to focus on Al-Qaeda, I think, is wrong. There was the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Harakat al-Mujahideen, and it was really a sort of I think somebody said the Woodstock of terrorism at one point, but I'm not sure if that's the right. But anyway, there were a lot of people there. It's not just Al-Qaeda. So, of course, negotiations are desirable, but there's a whole literature on this. That the way you get to the negotiating table is first of all a mutual recognition of a hurting stalemate. That may be beginning to happen. Trusted interlocutors. That's a little not really clear. So it's going to take a while. And one final piece of skepticism about all this is, where's Al-Qaeda headquartered today? It's headquartered in North Waziristan, right in the middle of the Haqqani network, which is the most effective of the Taliban militias, which pays nominal obeisance to Mullah Omar. And if you look at David Rowe's account of his own kidnapping, what's happening in North Waziristan doesn't suggest that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, are somehow at odds. Quite the opposite.
Right. You know more about bin Laden himself and Al-Qaeda than most, certainly. So take us inside Al-Qaeda a little bit and give us a picture of bin Laden. You talk a lot about bin Laden himself in the book, the charismatic hold that he has on his followers. You mentioned that you produced this video of bin Laden many years before 9/11. Tell us a little bit about him, and then I was surprised in the book by your saying that Al-Qaeda actually is a rather bureaucratic and prosaic organization. Salary levels laid out, a furniture allowance, generous vacation and leave policies, as if it were, IBM.
Well,
talk to us a little bit about that.
That's one of the points in one of the points in the book is that this is arguably one of the most bureaucratic terrorist groups in history. Like a lot of murderous organizations, they tend to be quite bureaucratic. We saw that with Saddam, we saw that with the Nazis, not to compare them with Al-Qaeda, but it wouldn't be the first murderous organization in history that was quite bureaucratic, and they had the kinds of bureaucratic infighting that we're all familiar with in Washington, and which Freud diagnosed usefully as the narcissism of minor differences, and they hated each other, and there was lots of disputes. But as Clark mentioned, we've recovered the bylaws of Al-Qaeda in the post 9/11 era. They run to 36 pages in English. They cover not just furniture allowance, but salary levels for people with X number of wives versus X number of wives, 2.5-month vacation schedule, which I think more generous than most American companies for members of Al-Qaeda. And that's kind of what they lost after 9/11. They lost that. This was, they had thousands of people going through their training camps. They had this, they were running a sort of quasi-parallel state to the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that was all obliterated. In terms of bin Laden himself, I spent a lot of time interviewing his friends, family, colleagues, companions in arms, various people that had worked with him, his best friend, now dead, in an unexplained murder in Madagascar in 2007. And, the picture that emerges from these interviews is it's pretty universal. This guy is very modest, humble. Even when he was living in Sudan, he didn't have air conditioning. He eschewed all the kind of, one of his wives left him on the very basis, you're a son of a billionaire, and it's like, we don't even have air conditioning. And this is ridiculous, essentially. So, he's been preparing for life on the run for a long time. He wouldn't let his kids have cold water. There's a very useful book by Omar bin Laden, one of his sort of estranged sons, and his first wife, Najwa bin Laden. And Najwa, they take the whole family out on these sort of survivalist trekking expeditions, which sounded pretty grueling. You're not allowed to bring anything with you, not allowed to eat very much. It's going to be overnight. He would march his sons through 14-hour trips through Tora Bora Mountains. So he's been preparing for life on the run for some period of time. And there's parts of this picture which are not unattractive. And what's interesting is that bin Laden has 53 siblings, none of whom have chosen this particular path. And so, why is it that, this guy who had these attributes then turned to violence is a very complicated question, which I think I'm not going to get into in detail now, but his life experiences just took him down this different path than the rest of his siblings. And, he's intelligent, he's well-informed, he thinks of himself as a big-picture strategic thinker. He isn't, it turns out. A smart person would have said, hey, the 9/11 attacks turned out to be a bit of a disaster for our organization. Let's reframe this and let's just go directly back to something that's more plausible, overthrowing the Saudi monarchy, overthrowing the Mubarak regime. Why, keep attacking the United States, and why have this 800-pound gorilla sort of following us around the world, making our lives difficult? And bin Laden didn't change that essential narrative. A part of it is, the final point is here, he's a religious fanatic and has been since his earliest days. He was, even as a teenager, and I interviewed his high school best friend, this was a guy who was fasting 7 times, praying 7 times a day, fasting twice a week, as a 13-year-old. And he'd have friends come around, and for their entertainment, they would be singing jihadi chants about Palestine as teenagers. So this was a religious zealot as a young man, and he really believes that he's defending true Islam. For people who say that Islam's got nothing to do with this, that's like saying that Christianity had nothing to do with the Crusades. It does have something to do with this. And bin Laden is able to call on verses in the Quran, which are in the Quran. The Quran isn't a book, it's the word of God, which speak for themselves. When the sacred months have passed, essentially you can kill the infidels. Now, there's plenty of people who say that these verses are abrogated by other verses, and bin Laden is very selective about the quotes he uses in the Quran. To kill one man to kill one person is as if to kill the whole of humanity is not something bin Laden, a very famous verse in the Quran that bin Laden doesn't use. So he's a religious fanatic. He's smart, but he's had a self-defeating strategy. He hasn't succeeded in any of his goals.
Let me ask 2 final questions, and I'll open it up. There's a chapter in the book, and the way you put it was Al-Qaeda's quixotic quest for weapons of mass destruction. You mentioned the 2004 presidential election. I remember that. I think the only thing that President Bush and Senator Kerry agreed about during the course of that campaign, during the foreign policy debate, was that the #1 threat to the United States is weapons of mass destruction falling into terrorist hands. President Obama has said that.
Right.
That's the nightmare scenario, especially with the instability in Pakistan, needless to say. So can you tell us a little bit about where Al-Qaeda was before 9/11 with regard to this surge, and where they are today, you think?
Of the 183 terrorist cases in the United States since 9/11 involving jihadist terrorist charges or convictions, none of them have involved chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, despite all the kind of hysteria, I would say, surrounding this issue that existed in the immediately after 9/11. Part of the hysteria was understandable. The anthrax attacks happened shortly after 9/11. It seemed to be that perhaps Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. There's still some controversy about whether it was Bruce Ivins or not, but let's say for the moment that it was either Bruce Ivins or someone very similar. Bruce Ivins, or the person who did this attack, were operating at the highest levels of microbiology in the world, and they only killed 5 people with the anthrax attacks. So the point is, microbiology is actually quite complex, and to do an effective biological attack is not easy. And of the 79 terrorists involved in the 5 worst anti-Western terrorist attacks that we looked at, only 1 had a biological degree, and that was from a very obscure Indonesian university. So, I'm not saying the terrorists aren't intelligent, and certainly, the literature demonstrates that they tend to be, middle class and educated, but they're also not leading microbiologists or nuclear scientists as a general proposition. So, point 1. Point 2, the history of Al-Qaeda's involvement in these weapons is a history of failure and an inability to understand even basic science. They experimented with ricin, which is not a weapon of mass destruction. It's a useful assassination tool if you can get it right. They never really got anywhere. The Run Ricin incident in London in 2003 turned out to be a false positive. There was a lot of hysterical coverage at the time, but then very little coverage of the fact that there was a false positive. The anthrax that they developed in Afghanistan was not pathogenic anthrax, meaning that it can't kill people. Anthrax, as you know, is naturally occurring. And it's very easy to acquire, but not pathogenic anthrax. And so the history of their own experiments in this was amateur and was one of failure. And of course, the worst thing that could happen to all of us is if anybody got hold of a nuclear weapon, whether it was a terrorist or anybody else. I mean, and of course, governments should be concerned about this issue, and and the idea, in fact, when Cheney, the much derided 1% comment, there's a 1% chance we need to, as a government, I think you need to be very worried about it, and that's not a completely crazy thing to think. However, the record of these groups in this area is really a total failure. And I don't get into it in the book because I had to cut. I wrote 240,000 words and I cut it down to 145, but only 145,000 words. But I had a fair amount of material in there about Amsham Rikyo. I mean, Amsham Rikyo is a group that had $100 million in the bank. It recruited the best and the brightest in the Japanese chemical, biological, a lot of scientists. It was able to go to the Soviet Union. They were willing to pay $50 million for a nuclear weapon. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was imploding, no, they had no takers. They went to the famous Kurtsov Institute in Moscow. They had long discussions with people there. No one, even at the time in Russia, where it was really people were desperate, no one was willing to work with Amsham Rikyo to give them any kind of nuclear know-how and material. Amsham Rikyo then, realized that the nuclear weapons was too hard. They had a plan for uranium mining in Western Australia. They even bought a ranch there. They then defaulted to chemical weapons, and the sarin gas attack killed, a dozen people in the Tokyo subway. Now, if you were to select a place where you could kill a lot of people very easily with anything, it's the Tokyo subway. And that's all they could do. So the point is, a group with unlimited resources and recruiting the best and brightest scientists in a country like Japan with a very high level of scientific expertise was still unable to really pull anything off. And so the history of all these groups suggests that that this is harder than people think. And it's not like in the movies where George Clooney steals a nuclear weapon or something. It just doesn't work like that. I have a great deal more detail in the book on this issue because I think it's an important one.
Final question. You're ultimately, I think it's fair to say from the book, pessimistic about our chances of catching bin Laden. I think you say that he's as likely to die of old age in his bed as he is to be captured by the United States and Allied forces. But you're ultimately optimistic about America's prevailing over Al-Qaeda. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think America's, Al-Qaeda is, there was a great President Obama comment about Al-Qaeda being small men on the wrong side of history, and I think that's the right approach. And George W. Bush, early on after 9/11, said that Al-Qaeda and its ideas would, be consigned to the graveyard of history's great lies, and I think that's sort of in the process of happening, because for the reasons that I outlined earlier, they're just the big Achilles heel they have is that they've killed a lot of Muslim civilians in Iraq, in Indonesia, in Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And these are groups that position themselves as defenders of true Islam. And I think there's a great West Point study where West Point looked at Arab language news accounts of terrorist attacks in the Arab world and found that 90% of the victims in the Arab language news accounts were described as civilians. And so this sort of speaks for itself, and I think that's the reason Al-Qaeda is just going to fade away over time. And unless they do something which they're congenitally incapable of doing, which is engage in conventional politics, they're not going to become like Hezbollah, they're not going to become like Hamas, they're not going to do anything for anybody. They're not tied to a specific territory. Now, on the issue of finding bin Laden, it took 15 years for the Israelis to find Eichmann, not for a lack of trying after the Holocaust. We had 20,000 American soldiers in Mogadishu looking for Mohammed Aidid in '93 and never found him. Whitey Bulger from Boston is still on the FBI's most wanted list, and he's been that way since 1999. And I could give you many other examples. So finding people is difficult, particularly if they're not talking satellite phones, they don't have people willing to drop a dime on them for a cash reward and these kinds of things. Bin Laden just celebrated his 54th birthday. He's not an old man. He could be 64, he could be 74 before we find him. I think it would be quite unpredictable that 10 years after 9/11 that we would be having a conversation about how bin Laden is still out there. And he will make a mistake. By the way, I mean, it is inconceivable to me that he won't release an audio tape in the next few days, because, I mean, he will feel absolutely compelled to talk about what's going on in the Middle East, trying to insert himself opportunistically into it. The chain of custody of that audio tape is the one way to find him. I'm sure everybody at the agency is well aware of this fact and is trying to stake out Al Jazeera bureaus if we're spending our money and looking at jihadi websites in Peshawar for where it will be uploaded or whatever. I mean, that's the one way to find him, or at least find a courier, one of the couriers in the chain of couriers. So, he has a catch-22. I quote Kofor Black in the book. I had the same conversation with him in 2003 when it didn't seem that it would take another 7 years to find him, which is the catch-22 for bin Laden. So you can have a hermit on the hill approach and say nothing and become irrelevant, or he'll say something and that keeps him kind of relevant but opens him to detection. And bin Laden has chosen, he's had at least 35 tapes, audio tapes, video tapes since 9/11, not to totally go down the hermit on a hill approach. And that is the one way to find him.
Thank you. All right, we'll open it up. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. Please make it a question as opposed to a comment. Please make it a short question, and please make it one question. Right here.
Peter, thanks. Garrett Mitchell. There are dueling narratives about the network of organizations that include Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and Lashkar, et cetera. One narrative has it that they really are more separate and distinct, and they have their own agendas. The Taliban really are more focused on Afghanistan and getting foreigners out, et cetera. Al-Qaeda is broader in its thinking. There's the competing narrative, which has a number of sort of proof points, which is that there are a number of ways in which these organizations have actually cooperated and trained and cross-trained each other. So I'm wondering two things that come out of that for me. One is, what is your sense today of which of those narratives comes closer to being the reality on the ground? And second, coming back to this interesting question that Clark raised about what is taking place in the Middle East today, if Egypt and if Bahrain and Libya, et cetera, were in fact all to have new leadership over the course of the next year or so, and if it were likely that, I won't say likely, and if it in each case it looked like they were leaning less towards an Islamic rule and more toward a sort of a more typical state network, organizational philosophy. Does that encourage the Al-Qaeda? Does that give them more capacity to be recruiting and to sort of reignite? So,
all right.
Tell us what you know.
Yeah. So relations between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and other groups, like-minded groups. I think it depends where you are. I think in southern Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda doesn't have much of a role to play, and nor does it have in Baluchistan. Part of this is a accident of geography, because when Tora Bora happened, they fled to the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, which, by the way, is a better place than anywhere else to hide in Pakistan, because at that time the Pakistani military wasn't really there. You know, you're not regarded as part of Pakistan by Pakistanis even. And so they ended up there. The Pakistani Taliban, which is there, they're embedded with. Elements like Lashkar-e-Taiba are there. And I think Al-Qaeda's influenced ideologically groups like Lashkar, because Lashkar, which focused on India, suddenly is attacking American Jewish targets in Mumbai, which kind of hadn't happened before. And so I think it depends where you are geographically to some degree. But in the federally administered tribal areas, there's a sort of alphabet soup of LET and IMU and Al-Qaeda and the TTP, and they're all quite similar in their goals, and they're together. On the issue of would more democratic societies in places like Egypt present more of an opportunity for Al-Qaeda? You know, the Islamist militant groups in Egypt basically shot themselves in the foot with their own activities in the 1990s. There's no great, I think, if you remember the Luxor massacre of '97, that was that put the kibosh on the whole thing. And that's within relatively recent memory. And I don't think there's any appetite for these groups in Egypt. They will certainly try and make an opportunity of it, but I just don't see them as, you know, they hate the Muslim Brotherhood, and the hatred is mutual.
Thank you. All right. Judith?
Judith Kipper. Peter, thanks. 2 quick points. Do you see any possibility of cleaning up North Waziristan, and by whom? And the other question I have, most of the groups you refer to are Sunni Muslim groups, extremists. Are there, to your knowledge, links between some of the bad guys in Iran and some of these, or any of these groups, for convenience sake, notwithstanding Hamas, which gets financial support? That's a different story.
Right. Well, I think on the latter point, you know, leaders of Al-Qaeda were living in Iran until relatively recently under some form of house arrest as part of a potential grand bargain with the United States that never came, and they were going to be, you know, sort of counters for this part of the exchange for the grand bargain. I think there's been reporting, seems fairly plausible, that a number of these Al-Qaeda leaders have left Iran and now ended up in North Waziristan. So the first part of your question, will there be action against North Waziristan by the Pakistani military? And I think the answer is no, because if I was General Kiani, I wouldn't do it either. I mean, what are their interests? Their interests are having a non-India aligned Afghanistan over which they have some control, and they know we're going to be leaving in 2014 now, or whenever it is we're going to leave, that they're going to be, you know, Afghanistan is not magically going to sort of detach itself from Pakistani territory, nor is India, and that's the strategic environment they're in. And so I don't think they're going to do anything more than they've done already, which is they've done something significant already, which is serious operations in southern Waziristan, serious operations in SWAT. These were not predictable 3 years ago, but I think they've reached the ceiling of what they're likely to do, because it's about the ceilings of what makes sense. And I see now that in the press that we're now making a virtue of this fact by saying that, well, now we've got all these really bad guys concentrated in North Waziristan. That's great, because now we can attack them with drones. And in fact, if you look at, we at the New America Foundation maintain a website of drone attacks. 88% of drone attacks are now in North Waziristan. So, I mean, we're going to deal with it in that manner, unless there's an attack in the United States or in London or somewhere traceable to North Waziristan, in which case the rules of the game will change.
All right. Ms. Gillenhorn?
Given what you said about the Al-Qaeda attack being a failed attempt on the United States, the amount of retribution that the United States took against Afghanistan and Iraq. How come people in that region haven't turned against Al-Qaeda?
Well,
I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of suffering for that one day of infamy.
yeah. 62% of Afghans have a favorable view of international forces in their country today. So that's down from 80% in 2005 when nationwide polling first began. You know, bin Laden is polling at sort of zero. He's one of the most reviled figures imaginable in Afghanistan. They don't like him at all. So, and I quote members of the Taliban in the book who say when they heard on the BBC Arabic service that planes had attacked New York and Al-Qaeda might be behind it, they were like, well, great, the Taliban are gone. That's including people who were inside the Taliban, because they understood that this was going to precipitate an American response which was going to get rid of this regime. So I don't think, I mean, certainly in Afghanistan, our response, it was the first time that Article 5 had been invoked by NATO. The UN really, on September 12th, talked about a sort of by any means necessary response. It was all right. And so there was a lot of, I think, around the world, as people recognized that this was a legitimate response. And in fact, there are small numbers of Muslim soldiers in Afghanistan right now from the UAE and from Jordan. You know, on Iraq, it's a whole different matter. I mean, clearly that was regarded in a very different way, and it had the very self-defeating effect of seeming to confirm bin Laden's master narrative of the war against Islam led by the United States, right? It seemed to play directly in his hands, and I think that, you know, if you do the thought experiment where the Iraq war hadn't happened, I think Al-Qaeda would be in a lot more danger, would be smaller in size and than it is. But essentially we handed bin Laden a life raft into which he very adeptly. Al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't exist before the war. Suddenly it took over a third of the country by 2006, according to the Marine Zone assessment, that they were essentially running Anbar province. Then, of course, Al-Qaeda inflicted a strategic defeat on itself in Iraq. But that's not something we could have foreseen. You can't say sort of post hoc that, well, this was all a brilliant plan to bring Al-Qaeda to Iraq where they would screw up so badly that they would destroy themselves. I mean, so that argument can't be made, but that's what certainly happened. And certainly, if you look at polling data around the Muslim world in the post-Iraq invasion, you know, in Turkey, where our numbers were at like 55%, they dropped to 7%. Like, the numbers aren't exact. In Indonesia, they went from 75% to sort of 22%. These are, you know, democratic Muslim countries that should be natural allies. So that was, of course, enormously counterproductive.
All right. Yes, sir.
Hi. Wouldn't this be a great time for Al-Qaeda to return to one of its original objectives, and that is to destabilize Saudi Arabia? Any indication that that's happening, or do you subscribe to the what seems to be the conventional wisdom that Saudi Arabia is somehow immune from what's going on today?
I don't think Saudi Arabia is immune. I think they're in a better position because I mean, for a start, King Abdullah is very popular. And I've even talked to people who are members of the opposition who've been in prison in Saudi Arabia, and they tend to say, we like the monarchy, we're concerned about civil war, we saw what happened in Iraq. And, you know, King Abdullah is probably the best king since King Faisal in terms of how Saudis feel and think about him. Now, of course, he's obviously got big health problems, so that can, and the people who might take over are all, you know, in their 80s. And so there is going to be a problem going forward. They, you know, are able to provide quite a lot to their populations. They also have a lot of religious legitimacy surrounding the fact that they have the custodians of the two holy places. So I mean, I think all those factors mean that they are less immune, not, you know, are somewhat immune to this. However, you could have said the same thing about Bahrain, you know, where you've got a very high standard of income, you've got a constitutional monarchy. I mean, obviously the Shia situation is different in Bahrain than it is in Saudi Arabia. But I mean, I don't think anybody's immune from this, right? I mean, there must be concerns in the Saudi royal family about this. Can Al-Qaeda exploit it in Saudi Arabia? I don't think so, because Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia did what they do in every other country, which is they start attacking the locals, and that blows any of their credibility out the window. And the Saudi government mounted an enormously successful repressive campaign against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Saudi Arabia, which wasn't just mounting a terrorist campaign against the Saudi state. It was almost a mini insurgency. I mean, they had thousands of well-trained guys. Many of those, 100 of them were killed. Thousands went into prison. The Saudi population turned against Al-Qaeda, and so I don't think the Saudi population wants Al-Qaeda back, even in the context of the Saudi royal family allowing a little bit more space for democratic kind of forces. Al-Qaeda would just not be part of it.
All right, this side. You, sir.
Geoffrey Joseph with the State Department. Something that continues to amaze many people is that 10 years after 9/11, there hasn't been a single follow-up attack in the United States. There are many reasons for this, but one primary reason seems to be Al-Qaeda's fetish with replicating an attack along the same scale and magnitude of 9/11 or exceeding it. Why hasn't Al-Qaeda adapted? Why haven't they recognized that a series of small-scale strikes on soft targets here in the U.S. would do just as much damage to our economy and our psyche?
I think they have adapted. I mean, if you look at the Najib al-Azazi plot of the summer of 2009, if he had succeeded with blowing up some backpack bombs made out of hydrogen peroxide on the Manhattan subway, he would have killed a few dozen people at most. So Najib al-Azazi was trained by Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda, the idea that they're waiting to get something as big as 9/11 or something even bigger is crazy. They're looking to get anything through, and Azazi underlines that. Similarly, Faisal Shahzad, who was trained by the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which is very much in the orbit of Al-Qaeda, if Faisal Shahzad had succeeded in blowing up the SUV and killing people in Times Square on May 1st, 2010, he would have killed a few dozen people. So they're looking to get anything through at this point. They're not waiting for the big one. By the way, there's a kind of final point about that, because I want to make. There was a kind of, it was not particularly in Washington, there was kind of a view until I think relatively recently that they're waiting to do something even bigger than 9/11. But in a sense, this was sort of unfalsifiable as an idea, because if they didn't do anything, then that was simply more evidence of the fact that they're waiting to do something bigger than 9/11. And as sort of as Karl Popper would say, unfalsifiable statements are not to be trusted.
Larry Korb.
Larry Korb from the Center for American Progress. You supported the surge in Afghanistan, and you
Yeah.
made some remarks here about what we'll leave in 2014, 2015. Is that the right policy, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, I support the surge in Afghanistan because I think that on multiple levels, it's the right thing to do. And the reason that it's the right thing to, I mean, it's not my personal opinion. I just quoted the nationwide polling data. Afghans don't want us to leave; they want us to perform, and they were very concerned about us leaving in July 2011 because they're perfectly aware that the Afghan army and government is not at a point where they're sustainable. And I think that I deal with this in quite some detail in the book, but Afghanistan was the least resourced post-World War II reconstruction effort the United States has been engaged in, according to a study by RAND. 30 times more per capita was spent in Bosnia, I think, 18 times more in Kosovo. I mean, we got what we paid for. We did it on the cheap, and the whole story about what happened there. The size of the American army in Afghanistan in 2003 was 6,000 soldiers. That's the size of the police department in Houston, in a country with 10 times the population and a country the size of Texas. It's just not going to cut it. And I think that what we have is a somewhat properly resourced effort. And what can we, there are a number of myths that are about Afghanistan which I don't subscribe to. One of which is no end state. Well, the end state is, if we could get Afghanistan to how it looked in the 1970s when it was a tourist destination at peace with its neighbors and itself, that's not a sort of dreamer vision that existed in the relatively recent past. Another kind of common view is the United States isn't really a nation state. Well, actually, Afghanistan is an older nation state than the United States. I mean, the first modern Afghan state was founded in 1747. I think there's cause for hope, and I think we've obviously got the right people involved in the job now, and I think that Afghans feel the same way.
In the back, David.
Hi, David Jackson. How many hardcore members of Al-Qaeda do you think there are in the world today? And
Okay.
secondly, given the pressure that the West has put on this organization, on their ability to move money and on their ability to communicate, how much longer can they exist?
Well, I mean, I can quote you back directly what Leon Panetta and what Mike Leiter have said on this. I think they're a better resource on this subject than I am. In Aspen, yes. Mike Leiter said 350 in Pakistan, and Leon Panetta 2 weeks earlier said 65 in Afghanistan. And then if you add in, say, 200 to 400 AQAP in Yemen, and I mean, we're talking, we're not talking about large numbers of people, but I think the focus on the numbers is mistaken on several levels. First of all, there are only 200 members of Al-Qaeda on 9/11. Members in the sense of they'd sworn an oath of allegiance personally to bin Laden. Secondly, small groups of people can continue doing damage for long periods. For instance, the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany probably only numbered a couple of dozen people in the 1970s, inflicted a tremendous amount of damage on the German state. And thirdly, Al-Qaeda's strength lies not in the numbers in its group, but the numbers of people that it can essentially persuade of its ideas. And so Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a group of, tens of thousands of guys, has been influenced ideologically by Al-Qaeda. TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, 30,000 members, influenced by Al-Qaeda. The Afghan Taliban, to some degree, influenced by Al-Qaeda, 25,000. The numbers mount up pretty. If you focus only on Al-Qaeda itself as a group, you're going to look at small numbers. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a several hundred man organization. But there are others that are influenced by the ideology, and then of course there are people who've got nothing to do with any of these groups who are influenced by bin Laden's ideas. Whether Jihad Jane in Pennsylvania, she's not a sort of signed-up member of Al-Qaeda, but she was planning to attack and kill a Swedish cartoonist who had painted a picture of the Prophet Muhammad that she objected to. So I think focusing on the numbers of Al-Qaeda is actually a mistake, and I actually think it's kind of a strange thing for the administration officials who talk about it, because I think it's sort of to miss the larger point. Given the fact also that it's an argument, going to your question, Larry Korb, I mean, if indeed the problem is Al-Qaeda and there are only 65 in Afghanistan, then kind of why are we doing what we're doing is I think that's the kind of chain of logic. And I think that what we're doing in Afghanistan is trying to prevent a recurrence of the Taliban taking over parts of the country where they would welcome back not only Al-Qaeda, but every terrorist Islamic group and insurgent group from around the globe, because that's what they've done. The idea that they won't do that is totally insane in my view, because we've run a controlled experiment on this question right across the border in Pakistan, where the Pakistani Taliban, who after all are not any really different from the Afghan Taliban really, in the sense that they're all in Pakistan, headquartered there and living there, they all share the same goals. And in Waziristan, the Taliban has welcomed all these groups back and is operating with them.
Sean Waterman?
Yes. If one of the major threats that terrorism poses is the danger of overreaction, and if there is, continues to be the possibility that as you alluded to earlier, that some kind of major attack, might be successful, what can we do now to try and guard against, the overreaction, to guard against the threat that a new attack might damage us in that way?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Sean. If we accept the idea that an attack of some form is inevitable, which it is, it may not be particularly large, but it will happen at some point. We're interested at New America Foundation in the idea of kind of creating a more resilient, along with many others, a more resilient United States, not just on a physical level, but on a societal level, which is that, and when we get attacked again, that we don't all freak out and do a whole set of things. I mean, the biggest threat in a sense is to our constitutional values. And we'd be doing Al-Qaeda's work for them if we suddenly did a lot of things that were overreactions in terms and threatened our own constitutional values. So, I mean, how do you prepare for that? Part of it is political. It's very, it's very hard for politicians to say some of these things. Janet Napolitano has said some of them, but there are three things that are true which seem to be slightly contradictory, but which need to be said. One is Al-Qaeda is not 10 feet tall. Two, the United States government is doing everything it can to protect you and is doing it pretty well. And three, by the law of averages, they will get one through at some point. All of these things are true, but they appear to be slightly in tension with each other. Now, for a politician, it's a very interesting question because giving that speech is quite difficult, although President Obama is clearly capable of doing it. But you can't give it after the event. So you can either not give it and just sort of think, okay, well, I'll just take the risk that it's not going to happen, or you give it and you might attract some kind of political heat for giving it in the first place. So it's a very difficult problem for politicians. But that is the speech that is kind of needs to be given, and I think that even as somebody as senior as Janet Napolitano isn't necessarily the right person for it. I think it's the president that has to say that.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a question about, you mentioned the idea of the Al-Qaeda and the leadership believing that they're in a stalemate situation. And I find that extremely interesting because if they were always kind of a sort of a fringe group, and in terms of their belief that they're kind of out in the mountains, kind of hidden, why suddenly are they in that position where they think that now we're stalemating? And as a follow-up to that, what kind of negotiating position would they have after that with the United States if they were to sit at a table?
I mean, I think you misunderstood me. I was talking about, the kind of conventional academic literature on negotiations suggests that a mutual recognition of a hurting stalemate is a precondition to having a negotiation. And I was describing that as what you would need between the United States and the Taliban. I don't think you can negotiate with Al-Qaeda on anything. I mean, what's their Well, for a start, you can't negotiate with people who you've made it abundantly clear is we want to kill everybody involved. I mean, that's you have to allow people way out. And with the Taliban, I think that President Obama, and this is something I deal with in the book, had a very interesting philosophical task when he assumed office, which was how to redefine the war on terror. Because we all know the war on terror was not a perfect construction on multiple levels. And he, I think, correctly made it a war against Al-Qaeda and its allies, which had the useful fact we named our enemies. It suggested this was not forever. It was kind of circumscribed in time and space, not this sort of open-ended, vague thing. But the reason that I think it's particularly useful is not only that it named Al-Qaeda, but it also said Al-Qaeda and its allies, suggesting that if you de-allied yourself from Al-Qaeda, we're not at war with you, which is essentially what we've offered the Taliban. I mean, essentially, if you revoke Al-Qaeda and all its works, that's one of where you can sit down and negotiate. So in terms of sitting down at the negotiating table with Al-Qaeda, that's not going to happen. In terms of sitting down and negotiating with Taliban, it's already happening. The question is, how long will it take and what will it yield? And I think there are many, many problems with that. One other problem I didn't mention earlier is the governments have already done peace deals with the Taliban, which have turned out to be very, very poor. The Pakistani government repeatedly did peace agreements with the Taliban, each one of which they reneged on and used as opportunities to expand their territory and power. In 2005 in southern Waziristan, in 2006 in northern Waziristan, in Swat in 2009. So we have a long history of Taliban negotiations which don't, again, suggest particularly useful outcomes. And we ourselves negotiated with the Taliban. Mike Sheehan, the ambassador for counterterrorism, and constantly was talking to the Taliban about bin Laden, and it yielded nothing.
I think we've got time for 2 more, maybe 3, depending on how short they are, and hopefully they'll be short. Alternating sides, so here, and then we'll go there.
Paula Gordon, GordonPublicAdministration.com, and an educator. 2 questions that
Let's make it
pertain
one.
to the Muslim Brotherhood. What is the nature of the antipathy between them and Al-Qaeda, and what is your prognosis of their role in the Mideast crisis right now?
Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, has written an entire book critiquing the Muslim Brotherhood for its involvement in conventional politics and democratic elections, which he thinks are against Islam. So, there's a lot of hostility. The Muslim Brotherhood itself has, rejected violence. So, I think that's the principal kind of dispute. What's their role in the future? I think it's going to be, quite important. I mean, I actually interviewed one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in London who's been in exile for 29 years, planning to go back to Egypt. Interviewed him a few days ago, and he he estimated that in a free and fair election that they would win 35% of the votes in Parliament. Now, is that true? You know, I don't know. We have to. Obviously, they're going to win some seats. They did have the advantage of being sort of banned but tolerated, so that they could run candidates in the 2005 election as independents. If it was a much freer and fairer, might they actually get a smaller proportion than they did in 2005? That's something we'll see. But I asked him on the question of Israel. He had a very interesting answer, which is we recognize the treaty, but if treaties are based on injustice, we'd have to, at some point, rethink about it. So that's a fairly mixed message. Also, on the question of Sharia law, he said, we don't want to impose Sharia on people, but if people want it, we'll go along with it. So anyway, so I think, again, that's a fairly mixed message. But I think, having also interviewed a lot of the leaders in Egypt in the past, these tend to be very boring doctors and lawyers, and they're not, revolutionaries. I think my personal view is that they're more likely to engage in conventional politics, and they also aren't running a presidential candidate, which is important.
Final question? The front row here. The front row here.
Thank you. Magda Krovo, cross-culture consultant and Egyptian. I wonder about the attack on the Copts in Egypt on New Year's Eve. Do you think that Al-Qaeda was behind that? Because if yes, this would be the first time that they attacked Christian minority. I mean, they attacked, for example, the Luxor attack was against tourists, but this was really singling out a Christian minority. So that would be really a very new tendency. So
I mean, so was Al-Qaeda involved in the attacks on the Coptic church in Alexandria? I think if not Al-Qaeda, a group operating in Al-Qaeda's name. And, we had attacks, as you remember, in Sharm el-Sheikh on hotels housing largely Israeli tourists. We had a number of attacks in 2004, 2005. There is a group I think a domestic Egyptian group that shares Al-Qaeda's values, if it's not called Al-Qaeda. And, but, the counter argument, which is interesting, is that in the protests in Cairo, Christians and Muslims were very much hand in hand. And so, if one of the efforts of Al-Qaeda is to foment hatred between Christians and Muslims in Egypt, again, this is one more sign of their increasing irrelevance, because there seems to be quite a lot of unity, but at least for the moment, between the groups, and we can just hope that lasts.
Well, there you have it, the longest war, the enduring conflict between America and Al-Qaeda. Please join me in thanking Peter Bergen.
Thank you, Peter. Great job. Thank you.